In 1969, 3 years before The Godfather was released, director Francis Ford Coppola declared the following.
The world is filled with guys who said, well, I'm going to make the money and then make the personal films, and somehow they never get around to doing it.
The man who recorded this statement was a young filmmaker who hadn't yet directed a feature film, whose name was George Lucas. Those familiar with George Lucas know how ironic this is, since after making billions of dollars from creating the Star Wars franchise, in the 40-plus years after the first Star Wars film was released, Lucas never directed a film outside of the franchise again. Instead, much to the disdain of Star Wars fans, he has continually used his resources to make both major and minor revisions to previously released Star Wars films to, in his own words, complete the films the way I originally intended them to be. To better understand where Lucas's obsession stems from, in this video we are going to explore Lucas's origins as an experimental filmmaker and how his experience working within the studio system on his debut film THX 1138 spawned a lifelong obsession of continually tweaking his past films. Our story begins a long time ago in 1944 in a galaxy far, far away called Modesto. It was in this town in California's San Joaquin Valley that George Lucas was born. In high school, Lucas competed in underground races at local fairgrounds and wanted to become a professional race car driver. However, that changed a few days before graduating high school when he was involved in a near-fatal car accident, which inspired Lucas to participate in safer hobbies like film.
I was hit broadside by a car that was going about 90 miles an hour. I should be dead. And from that moment on, I said, you know, I'm operating an extra credit, therefore I can do anything I want, and therefore let's just go for it.
Because Lucas is best known for conventional big-budget films that appeal to mainstream audiences, you would guess similar films like Lawrence of Arabia would be what drew Lucas to filmmaking, especially since it won Best Picture the same year as Lucas's car accident, and would later inspire Raiders of the Lost Ark. However, it was actually the films of the Canyon Cinema Co-op that were being shown in nearby San Francisco that sparked his interest in the medium. Unlike mainstream films that were made by the Hollywood studio system with profit in mind, the films of Canyon Cinema were produced and financed by filmmakers looking to experiment with the capabilities of film as an art form. Because these filmmakers were free from the financial constraints of filmmaking, their films were able to be more personal and innovative than their Hollywood counterparts. This approach to filmmaking led to the production of films like Bruce Conner's 1958 experimental short titled A Movie. In this 12-minute short, Conner explores how previously shot found footage can be recontextualized and given new meaning by using jarring cuts and false endings to evoke certain ideas and feelings from the viewer. Experimental films like these are what inspired Lucas to enroll in USC School of Cinematic Arts in 1964. As evidenced by Lucas's first student short at USC, Look at Life, Lucas was not just intrigued by experimental films, but was interested in making his own experimental shorts that explored the visual capabilities of film.
George's films right from the beginning had a freedom and an inventiveness and a boldness to them that were astonishing.
Lucas's fascination with visual storytelling was further developed from a class taught by the dean of USC's film school, Slavko Vorkapich, who was an early pioneer in montage filmmaking and crafted many of the montage sequences in classic Hollywood films. In this class, Lucas received first-hand industry knowledge of how abstract, visually driven filmmaking could be used to further storytelling in a way that resonated with mainstream audiences. Lucas's time at USC was further enhanced by the Dirty Dozen. No, not the film, but the tight-knit group of USC film students who named their group after the film. Members of this group, like John Milius and Walter Murch, would go on to help make some of Lucas's and Hollywood's biggest films.
They always call that the class the stars fell on, and that does happen in places. There was that class at West Point that had Patton and Bradley and all these people, and I always liken it to that, since I consider USC the West Point of Hollywood.
By collaborating with this talented group, Lucas's productions grew in scale as he focused on refining a filmmaking style that used cinematic devices to convey abstract emotional experiences. During the same time, college campuses across the Western world were experiencing a counterculture revolution as the newly emerging generation of the 60s began questioning the long-held societal beliefs and ideals of previous generations. This resulted in many college students becoming politically active and protesting against government corruption and for individual freedoms. It was from this movement that Dirty Dozen members Walter Murch and Matthew Robbins wrote a short film for Lucas to direct called Electronic Labyrinth THX 1138 4EB. In this 15-minute film, a man is pursued by a futuristic Orwellian-like government as he tries to escape his oppressive civilization.
I like the idea of a futuristic, sort of brave new world. And I wanted to do something extremely visual, that had no dialogue and no character and that sort of thing, and sort of cross between a theatrical and a non-theatrical kind of experience.
Because of the short's cinematic device-driven filmmaking and counterculture themes, the film won first place at the National Student Film Festival. In particular, Lucas was praised for his use of jarring visual techniques and abrasive sounds to make the audience anxious, as if they were the ones being pursued, like the film's protagonist.
It absolutely stopped the festival. I mean, whatever was happening that night, and you could hear a pin drop in the theater. It was like the greatest incentive from one film student to another I had ever been gifted with. I was just floored.
Shortly after the success of Electronic Labyrinth, Lucas then won a student scholarship from Warner Brothers that allowed him to observe and work on any Warner Brothers film he wanted. So he chose a musical starring Fred Astaire called Finian's Rainbow. This out-of-character choice was not driven by Lucas's admiration for Fred Astaire musicals, but instead by his desire to meet the film's director, Francis Ford Coppola, who was a former UCLA film student and was seen as the first example of a film school student who had found success in Hollywood.
Everybody knew about Francis because Francis was the one film student, he went to UCLA, who had actually made a feature film.
This feature film was called You're a Big Boy Now. Because You're a Big Boy Now was set and shot in New York City, away from the eyes of the studio, Coppola was given a considerable degree of creative control over this film. However, because Finian's Rainbow had a budget 4 times larger than You're a Big Boy Now, and was shot on the Warner Brothers backlot, Coppola's creative control was limited as the studio executives were more involved with the film's production.
I could see how it worked and how basically the film director was a cog in the machine, but really it was hard to hold out for any kind of vision that you might have.
Lucas and Coppola became close friends during the production of Finian's Rainbow, and Coppola vented to Lucas his frustrations of being a director in the studio system.
Francis said, I've had it with these big Hollywood movies, I've had it with Hollywood, I don't want to do this, I want to do something more interesting.
Coppola was not the only Hollywood director feeling this way. Since the studio system's inception, directors have battled with studio executives over creative control. The studio system of the 60s that Coppola was dealing with, however, was only a shell of its former self. For you see, by the late 60s, the movie moguls who built and ran the Hollywood studio system, like Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohen, Darryl Zanuck, and Jack Warner, had retired, and the studios were now being run by corporate businessmen who did not value the artistic process of filmmaking and were only looking to maximize profit for shareholders.
The guys who make the decisions in the movie business, they don't know anything about movies. They don't want to know anything about movies. They know about marketing. They know about advertising. They know about the business end of things. I tell you, there are a lot of them that don't even read.
Though this leadership's goal was to maximize profit, the result of their leadership financially crippled the studio system. Because studio heads relied on marketing reports to determine what and how films were made, studio films were being made based on what audiences liked in the past, and were not capable of keeping up with the public's changing interests. This resulted in the production of box office flops like Paint Your Wagon, where we get to hear Clint Eastwood sing this.
I tell you my dreams, and while you're listening to me, I suddenly see them come true.
This problem compounded as the aforementioned counterculture generation was deeply against the previous generation's interests. As such, without a way to secure the youth market, movie theater attendance plummeted.
The studio system essentially collapsed in the early 60s. By 63, it was over. And nobody knew what the hell to do.
Meanwhile, European films from directors like Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut, and Federico Fellini offered young Americans the new ideas that studio films lacked. Because the European film industry respected the creative vision of the director, they were given the creative control to make innovative, rule-breaking films that appealed to counterculture audiences. To replicate the creative freedom European directors had, Coppola convinced Warner Brothers to allow him to shoot his next film, The Rain People, away from the influence of the studio with a minimal crew on location as they road tripped from New York to Los Angeles.
On The Rain People, Warner Brothers didn't want me to make them. I mean, they couldn't care less about this movie. I merely went into them one day and I said, it's Friday, Tuesday, we're flying to New York and we're going to shoot some film for my new movie. They said, what's it about? What's the story? We got to approve it. I said, well, if you don't want to make it, I'll pay for it myself, And I walked out.
Coppola also helped Lucas by convincing Warner Brothers to pay Lucas to film a documentary about the making of The Rain People.
Can you tell us something about your young assistant, George Lucas?
Well, he's not my assistant, actually.
Can you tell us about your young...
Associate. Associate, okay. George won an award to come to Warner Brothers and observe a film being made there, and he came when we were making Finian's Rainbow, and one day I was working on the show, and I kept seeing the skinny kid with a beard, and he was always looking. I went up to him and I said, well, I said, who's that? And he said, well, he's observing you.
I think the student films are the only real hope. I think they're slowly beginning to realize that students know what they're doing.
Lucas also began writing the screenplay for a feature-length version of Electronic Labyrinth while shooting his documentary on the making of The Rain People. Meanwhile, Dennis Hopper, a supporting actor in films like Cool Hand Luke and True Grit, had ideas similar to Coppola's about the studio system that led to Hopper filming his debut film, Easy Rider. Hopper's film was also made away from the eyes of the studio and with a small crew as they road tripped across the country. Easy Rider instantly became a cultural phenomenon and immediately changed Hollywood forever. Because it explored and sympathized with the counterculture viewpoint that Hollywood had ignored, young Americans were eager to see the film. This resulted in the film making $60 million at the box office on a budget of only $360,000. Thus proving to the studios that American-made, artistically driven films would appeal to the youth market and could be extremely profitable.
And so that movie, more than any other, completely changed the corporate concept of what would be a hit movie.
Even though The Rain People was made in the same way as Easy Rider, it failed to connect with audiences in the same way and was not a box office success, even though it was released only 3 weeks later. However, this didn't deter Coppola. Now that Hollywood understood how profitable the youth market could be, he approached Warner Brothers with his most ambitious project yet, American Zoetrope. American Zoetrope was to be an artist-driven film production company based in San Francisco that allowed filmmakers to make films how they wanted under the supervision of Coppola and not Warner Brothers. In other words, American Zoetrope was to be a space where filmmakers could make their films without the input of the studio. Seeing this as their opportunity to duplicate the success of Easy Rider, Warner Brothers agreed to finance the production company.
They financed him, which is a very dangerous thing. It's like financing Castro or something. I mean, you're going to have a result that might not be the one you want.
Warner Brothers supplied American Zoetrope's startup costs and also commissioned the company to make 7 films. The first of which was Lucas's directorial debut, a feature-length version of Electronic Labyrinth THX 1138 4EB, more simply called THX 1138. Because Coppola believed that filmmakers should be given complete artistic freedom to pursue their vision, he remained fairly hands-off during the production of THX 1138, even though Warner Brothers expected him to be an executive producer and guide the film with Lucas. This meant that Lucas was given full artistic control over a studio picture at the age of 25. To illustrate how much Warner Brothers' thought process had shifted since Easy Rider's success, consider this. In 1968, Coppola was 29 and already directed 2 films for Warner Brothers and was given a budget of $750,000 to make The Rain People. A year later, in 1969, Lucas was only 25 and had only previously made a behind-the-scenes documentary for the studio, but was given a budget of $777,000 to make THX 1138. As such, Lucas found himself in an extremely unique position. The Canyon Cinema-inspired experimental filmmaker was given free rein to make a studio picture how he envisioned it.
my vision was not to do a normal story. I wanted to do something that was abstract. Walter and I would sit, for hours trying to figure out how abstract that was going to be.
It was a film from the future rather than about the future.
In order to make the film feel like it was an artifact from the future, the audience had to believe that the film was also shot and made in the future. This meant that Lucas had to tailor every aspect of the film to make sure it was contributing to this goal. This was accomplished through Lucas's economical use of real locations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area to portray the futuristic dystopian society the film was set in.
It's a contemporary story. It's about today. And therefore I want to make it out of existing things so that everything there is real, only altered slightly in order to give it a kind of alien look.
We were going in and out of Lawrence Livermore Lab and the BART tunnels and the civic centers and, all of these places that they had arranged to get access to.
The efficiency with which George was able to make that film and to sort of create his world of that future using nothing other than existing locations, was pretty phenomenal.
In addition, Lucas also made creative character design decisions, like having all of the characters in the film shave their heads, which not only contributed to further selling the film was from another time, but also reinforces the film's themes of conformity and the decline of creative expression. Because THX 1138 was supposed to be from the future, it also needed to be edited with that in mind. Lucas edited the film in his house with friend and fellow Dirty Dozen member Walter Murch, and for the next year, Lucas would edit the film's picture during the day, while Walter Murch would edit the film's sound at night.
And then over dinner, his breakfast, my dinner, we would talk about what I'd cut during the day and what I thought, where I thought the soundtrack would go and what we were doing, and then he would spend the whole night cutting sound.
The clatter of film was heard 24 hours a day.
Their goal was to create a style that represented what feature films might look like, and the result was a more accessible version of the hyperkinetic visual and auditory style Lucas originally employed in Electronic Labyrinth. When Lucas and Murch finished editing THX 1138, Lucas's goal was realized. He was able to make a film that represented his complete, uncompromised creative vision. In other words, Lucas was a filmmaker with complete control over his film, an anomaly in the studio system. However, what would happen next would irreversibly shape Lucas's career for the rest of his life. Coppola had to take the finished film and screen it for the executives at Warner Brothers. Before the screening, Coppola gave an impassioned speech about how proud he was of the film Lucas had created, and that Coppola's hands-off producing approach would be replicated on all future American Zoetrope productions. Coppola should have waited to give this speech until after the screening, because the executives at Warner Brothers hated THX 1138. Even though Lucas carefully crafted a film from the future, the film did not make any attempts to explain this concept to the viewer, so the executives found it too inaccessible for mainstream audiences.
We were trying deliberately to be mysterious, which I think is one of the things that drove Warner Brothers mad. The film made no attempt to explain any of this or to draw judgments about it or to say that it was bad or good. It just said, this is an artifact which, instead of washing up on our shore from a distant land, has washed up from the future, and make of it what you will.
As such, the film went over the heads of the executives who were concerned with figuring out how to market a film this unconventional.
There was nobody in the room, I must confess, that thought they knew what to do with THX 1138. Had everybody thought, holy Christ, it's Easy Rider 2, and we're going to make a fortune, everybody would have hugged and kissed. But when nobody figured out how to distribute it at our place, and everybody thought it was a loser, not a big expensive one, but a loser, then it all started to unravel.
In response, Warner Brothers lost faith in Coppola, canceled the remaining 6 films it ordered from American Zoetrope, and bankrupted Coppola by asking him to return the money he was given to start up American Zoetrope. In addition, Warner Brothers took the negatives for THX 1138 and recut Lucas's film.
There was no point for them to do it other than to exercise some power and say, we can screw around with your movie, so we're going to. We don't understand it. We don't want to understand it. But we know that if we cut 5 minutes out of it, it'll make it shorter. And we fought it, and they did it, and I was angry about it.
In other words, Lucas wasn't upset about how much the studio removed from the film, but rather the fact that the studio stepped in and made revisions to a film that was supposed to be free of studio involvement.
I remember George's analogy about this, and it's still so vivid in my mind, because part of me believes this. He said that it's as if they took your little 4-year-old daughter, and they say, we know how to make her better. And they cut off only one finger, and they give her back to you, and now she's fine. She has 9 out of 10. I mean, come on. 9 fingers out of 10 is not that bad. What's your problem?
To further rub salt in Lucas's wounds, Warner Brothers' version of THX 1138 underperformed at the box office, making other studios less likely to work with Lucas in the future, as they assumed the film's shortcomings were the result of the young filmmaker's inexperience. This must have been especially infuriating to Lucas, as critics at the time praised the parts of Lucas's directorial style that survived the Warner Brothers revisions.
It was kind of confirmation for all of George's feelings about Hollywood, which is that they didn't want to let him make his movie.
Ultimately, Lucas would win his war against Warner Brothers. For the rest of his career, Lucas refused to make any films for the studio again, which resulted in the company losing out on both the Star Wars and Indiana Jones franchises. In addition, in 2004, Lucas made a director's cut of THX 1138 that included the footage that Warner Brothers cut. This version of THX 1138, released more than 30 years after the film's debut, is widely proclaimed as Lucas's lost masterpiece and has replaced Warner Brothers' version as the definitive cut of the film. By viewing George Lucas's later career moves through the lens of the THX 1138 debacle, his obsession with continually tweaking and adding to the Star Wars franchise instead of using his resources to make his own personal experimental films is both understandable and disheartening. On one hand, it can be argued that Lucas's negative experience with THX 1138 and the studio system was necessary for him to later make one of the most successful films of all time. But, on the other hand, had Warner Brothers released Lucas's version of THX 1138, it's not outlandish to suggest the results would have been just as monumental to film history. Warner Brothers' full support of Lucas's stylistic abstract film could have been seen throughout Hollywood as a vote of confidence in American zoetrope's artist-driven style of filmmaking. This could have furthered the desire for studios to finance artist-driven films in the same way Easy Rider had, ultimately pushing the Hollywood studio system as a whole closer to the European style of filmmaking, where film is seen as more of an art than a commercial product. Regardless, Lucas's experience with THX 1138 illuminates the challenges that exist for filmmakers who must rely on the financial resources of the Hollywood studio system to make their films. Even though filmmaking is a collaborative art form, collaborating with a multinational media conglomerate can yield disastrous results, as not only do financiers get final say, but unlike the collaborators you will find on a film set, their intentions are to make a product that will turn a profit, and not a transgressive piece of art. Fortunately, in Lucas's case, even though the scars of his experience making THX 1138 clearly remain, the later financial success he enjoyed in his career has given him the privilege to escape the oppressive tendencies of the Hollywood studio system, allowing him to enjoy the same degrees of artistic freedom as his original inspiration, the Canyon Cinema filmmakers.
On the day I was born, said my father, said he, I've an elegant legacy waiting for ye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Celluloid Cinema so you don't miss out on future film-related video essays.
World falls apart. That was the verse of Look to the Rainbow from Finian's Rainbow.